Okay, so welcome YouTube. This is Pastor Eric Kelly of Action Church. We've got Brother Corey who's going to be teaching tonight. He's going to be teaching on Naomi and Ruth, and I'm going to go ahead and turn over to him and get out of the way. I'll pull up the slides as I bring you on, Brother Corey. You can go ahead and open up your camera. I'm going to make you a small thumbnail.
Gotcha. Good to go? You guys can hear me and see me okay, right?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
Yes.
We good to go, Pastor Eric?
Yeah, go ahead, Brother Corey.
Thank you so
All over to you.
much. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. We're going to continue the series of the year of the collaboration. Last time we talked and I taught, we had a number of people taught teaching Bible study this year, and Pastor Eric and Apostle Sharon, came up with the year of collaboration. And there's so much collaboration that we can find throughout the Old and New Testament. Today we're going to talk about Naomi and Ruth. There's so much information. I'm hoping to continue this at some point, if under Pastor Eric and Apostle direction, to move on to Ruth, the whole entire book of Ruth. There's a lot of great information in there, and me being a former um, Mason, we spoke a lot about that. I'm no longer in the lodge, but there's a lot of great information within the book of Naomi, or the book of Ruth itself. But her and Naomi, had a such a very much so unlikely collaboration and unlikely relationship. God can use us all, as we spoke before when I spoke about Aaron, um, in in the book of where we talked about Egypt, and we talked about Aaron uh, and Israel. So let's discuss what we already know about Naomi and Ruth. We are so relieved that, we have finally, when we move into the book of Ruth, exited Judges. Judges is so gloomy and dark, and there's so much famine and so much terrible things within Judges. So it's all so great to move into the book of Ruth and see something good happening. As although it's a lot of sorrow and sadness, there's a lot of good things that came out of that relationship as a whole. So when we talk about that, I want to say, I have to tell you, and realize quickly, and we have not completely escaped the narrative of being engaged over the period of time in past, especially here now in the past few months. Because according to the verse, what we have and we're about to find out within this book, although it's short, Ruth is not very long, it's considered one of the short stories, in fact, occurring during the days of Judges. So this is not exactly an event that takes place after what, we studied in Judges. It's something that actually occurs in today's events that we have to explore together. Nevertheless, we just want to have no reason to fear, have no reason to cringe. You have no reason to think that, while we're here, we'll be here again. it's time to brace ourselves and behold some of the, abominable practices and some scary stuff that, some churches don't like to speak about. And I'm glad that we here at Action Church don't shy away from those things. It's not always great. It's not always good. It's, to follow God and to give your life to Christ. It's a lot of burden, but there's also a lot of great things that come out of it. And so we need to be prepared and prepare our hearts and mind for what he has for us. And you'll see in Naomi and Ruth, they did just that. I say again, we have no reason to think that while we're here again, we want to brace ourselves. God provides working in so many kinds of ways, so many different life remnants, especially enough another book, such as, Ruth and Esther. And Esther, so we have Ruth and Esther in both of these books that were named in the name of a woman by woman, or two other stories that actually deal with romance. And in a Gentile, in both stories, though, that romance plays preserving, saving God's people. And an incredible things that we witness. And when we come to look at the book of Ruth, we'll realize some things that we have not seen previously in Judges, rather that we don't see in Ruth itself, but we'll see, later on. God in these 4 chapters, Judges, Ruth, and follow on, chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, that it doesn't mean that God is not working in our situations. He's around. It may not feel good. It may not be good at the time, but just know that he is maneuvering and he's performing and preparing us for what is to come. It's not easy to follow Christ, but when we give our all in all and give our life to Christ and appoint him as the head of our house and the head of our lives, things come, things go, but he never leaves us, again, nor forsake us. When we go into our study guide, we'll talk about the background of each collaborator, Ruth and Naomi. We'll talk about, some of their offsprings and things like that. But the root of this is really talking about the relationship between these two. We'll talk about their collaborative work, what type of relationship they had, each individual calling and assignments of them. We'll describe their collaboration and how it entails and how it ties in with biblical references and what's to come after this relationship, and the will of how God's will for their collaboration revealed. We will see just how he utilized Ruth and Naomi throughout this teaching. And we have, at the end, we're going to talk about some lessons we learned while we're teaching. Next slide. Again, we'll briefly talk about these two later on down in the slides, the biblical collaborations, the covenant collaborators, how strategic they were, how they worked together, who was the mentor or mentoree. We can already decide who that is just from knowing Naomi and Ruth's story. The antagonist collaborators who worked together throughout the conflict. They met with so many different conflicts. And the unlikely collaborators assigned to move God's will forward without intending on doing so, but just having faith and trust in God along the way. Next slide. Biblical references. We got our core scriptures, which is Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. We'll actually go through all of these, the entire chapter, not word for word, but throughout it, you will understand and be able to pick and choose where I pulled that information from and how we expound on it. There should be some references at the end of some of mine, works cited and things like that, so we'll know where to go back and look. But we'll talk about Ruth chapter 1 run through 17. We'll finish up with, we'll talk about Galatians and the Gentiles and stuff like that as well. And then we'll also really elaborate on verse 11 and 12 in chapter 2 of Ruth. And we'll talk about Ruth chapter 3, verses 10, and as well chapter 4, 13 and 17. Just for references, not going into those, we're going to stick with chapter 1 in 16 and 17. And 16 and 17 reads just as you see it there. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you." This is the New King James Version. "Don't urge me to leave you or turn your back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." This is Ruth speaking to Naomi, who was her mother-in-law, as we'll talk about in this next slide and follow-on slides. Next slide. So when we just mentioned Ruth, let's go and understand who Ruth is. I know everybody knows, just for people that just want a refreshing, and just for myself, when I decide to teach this again and expound on it, I know exactly where to pull information from and what exactly to say. Ruth in Hebrews means rut, or root. I don't know exactly how they pronounce that, but Ruth means friend, companion, and a vision of beauty. Ruth is actually a Moabite, Moabite woman known for her loyalty and faithfulness. Naomi, on the other hand, Naomi is Ruth Israelite's mother-in-law, who experienced great loss and returned to Bethlehem. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. And also Ruth, a wealthy Boaz, a wealthy Israelite relative who acts as a kinsman redeemer, marrying Ruth and later preserving the family line. We'll go jump into that as well. Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion is Naomi's husband and their two sons, who also passed away along the journey of Naomi and Ruth. Next slide. And Naomi, on the other hand, is a Hebrew name for pleasant, sweet, and delightful. This reflects her initial character as a woman of being such graceful and full of kindness. Naomi also is, as I said earlier, is the mother-in-law of Ruth. We talked about her experiencing great loss and return to Bethlehem. Elimelech is Naomi's husband, and they had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who married Oprah, a Moabite woman, while his brother Mahlon married Ruth. Ruth's first marriage. Next slide. So Ruth and Naomi's home. As we said earlier, Ruth is a Moabite. Naomi is from Bethlehem. As you can see, this is the Jordan River in between here. Elimelech, I'm sorry. Elimelech left Bethlehem and moved to Moab. He took his wife, which was at the time, which was Naomi, and moved her from Bethlehem to Moab, which was such a terrible time to move. Moab is not a very nice place to be. I've never been there, but from reading scripture, they was always in an uproar. They did not have a very good relationship with the people of Israel or the people of Bethlehem and Jerusalem as well. They were across the water, across the Jordan River, so it wasn't quite distant. It's not, although it looks small on that, they traveled quite a way to move away from Bethlehem. We often find ourselves in conflict when we go against and do things that's out of the will of God. It is important that we understand when God tasks us with something, when he entrusted us to do something, when he tells us to do something and we don't do it, there are significant consequences behind those actions. we have got to always stay in God's presence and seek his face. I am learning this as I get older. I'm learning this now, and I'm just going to be definitely extremely 100% transparent. I didn't always listen. I cared a lot about what people said. So when I discovered and told someone who I thought was who cared about me and loved me at the time, that I have been called to preach. I've always had a battle in fighting, to stay holy and to stay in God's presence. And when I told her that information, she laughed in my face, as if God couldn't use me. And there was something about me that was unclean or whatever her reasoning behind her chuckle and laugh, and totally just shot me down when I told her about the encounter I had in the middle of the night. I was a young Marine at the time in Hawaii, and it discouraged me for a very long time of doing God's work. And when I say discouraged me, they were talking 1998, and here I am, we're 2026. And I'm just now starting to try to get back and get things together, and do what he has tasked me to do. I have suffered a while. I'm still suffering, and I don't look back. I don't dwell on it, but I know a lot of the issues that I had, a lot of issues that I went through, is because of my lack of obedience and my disobedience. So as we continue to talk through the book of Ruth, we will see how disobedient disrupted this entire family dynamic, and how they paid with their lives. And it was not a good thing. It was not an easy thing for them to witness, especially Ruth and Naomi. Like I said again, the home of Naomi was from Bethlehem. She was a very God-fearing woman, considered a holy woman, and so was Elimelech at the time. But he was disobedient and lost his way at some point. Ruth, on the other hand, was a Moabite. Moabites served their own God. The Moabite God is what they call it. They did not reference the God that we reference. They did not know. They knew, but they had served and chose to serve their own God, which was a God of Moab, the God of Moabites. Next slide. So the pre-collaboration relationship between Ruth and Naomi. Of course, they were connected through marriage, because we already said that Naomi was Ruth's mother-in-law. And Naomi was, of course, the matriarch of the house once, and they had two sons, which is Mahlon and Chilion. Naomi, at the time, when she was married to Naomi's son and Elimelech's son, I guess they appeared to be happy, but her sons died, Mahlon and Chilion. They did not have a very, very good time in Moab. It was a lot of sorrow, a lot of sadness, and of course, famine. Naomi and Ruth did not grow up together, as we know, because she was from Moab and Naomi was from Bethlehem. They certainly did not share the same nationality. They didn't share the same culture. They did things differently. Their heritage was differently. Their language even was differently. And of course, as we just spoke, their religious background were different. Their relationship began as an ordinary family relationship through marriage, of course, not blood. Naomi was an Israelite, but she widowed because Mr. Elimelech died also. Ruth was the Moabite woman. Naomi was significantly older. Of course, she was the mother-in-law, so we would think that she was kind of elderly, but full of wisdom. Ruth worshiped gods of Moab, as I just told you, before coming to know God, the God of Israel. And we have to thank Naomi for that. Ruth had no covenant obligation to remain with Naomi after her husband died. Unlike Moses and Aaron, who we spoke about in my previous study, they weren't blood related. So they had no pre-collaboration relationship. Their connection came, again, through marriage. Naomi was Israelite from Bethlehem. Ruth was a Moabite woman from the nation of Moab. Next slide. Like we said earlier, they were separated by more than nationality. As we shared, they had different cultures, different tradition, different religious background, different generations. And we said, unlike Moses and Aaron, they weren't blood related. They were completely different. Next slide. When we talked about Aaron and Moses earlier, they had several plagues that they experienced throughout their collaboration. The Bible does not speak of plague here between the time of the book of Ruth and Naomi's collaboration. But they were the famine, which was enough. No food, no water, things like that. So they suffered quite a bit, and it was life-threatening, forcing Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons to flee to Moab in search of sustenance, like barley and the things that they found in Moab. After the death of Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, there was no expectation for Ruth to remain with Naomi. And Naomi would, communicate this to Ruth. You can leave. You shouldn't stay with me. Naomi, although still had much faith, she felt cursed. She felt dirty. She felt nasty, and she had nothing to offer Ruth or Orpah. Instead of leaving, Ruth chose to stay. I have a picture down there where you can see her grasping her, and I can imagine that because every time I think of the book of the book of Ruth and Naomi's relationship and reading those verses, I can almost feel her actually clinging on to her, like, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stay here with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lie, I will lie. Where you live, I will live. Where you die, I will die. She was extremely loyal to her mother-in-law, and I take that relationship was very, very, very full of love, and she adored her. Oprah, on the other hand, I'm not saying that she didn't, but she left. It was a lot of sorrow. Naomi lost her husband. They lost their father-in-law. Ruth lost her husband, and so did Oprah. She had nothing left. Naomi had nothing left. She lost her husband, and she lost her only two children, which was Chilion, and Mahlon. So she was full of sorrow. I can only imagine, what the pain would be of losing a child, period. I know what it's like to lose a dog, and it's dreadful. I still hurt. I can imagine what pain would be like to lose a kid. But to lose both of them and the man that you had them with, your husband, it had to have been extremely terrible for Naomi. And Ruth being there to witness all of this, but she was willing to suffer along with her, but she was not going to leave her side. And Ruth's declaration in that within 16 and 17, as we said earlier in that verse, from the moment forward, they no longer were connected only by marriage. They were united by faith, commitment, which I highlighted there, and God's perfect purpose for their lives and what he needed them to do. And you'll see that once they came aboard and followed God's lead, much was created. such greatness. I'm hoping to discuss that sometime later as well. Any questions before we continue? Next slide. I would think Ruth would have a much darker tan at that point, but we'll still use that picture because that's the only one I could find. Move to the next slide. So when we look at collaboration type, and I have a couple of pictures there, and that depicts of Naomi, Ruth and Naomi's loyalty to one another, great loss that they sustained in their unexpected restoration. They had no idea what was going to be, what lies ahead. All they know is that Ruth chose to stay with Naomi, and Naomi chose to allow her to, and just to mentor her, to teach her, and to get her to be closer to God and to draw her nearer to God. And you'll see that this was a very, very, very prosperous tactic. This collaboration relationship produced something phenomenal. Naomi and Ruth were unlikely collaborators in the beginning, of course. They didn't know each other because she lived in Moab, and Naomi lived in Bethlehem. They probably would have never, ever, ever collaborated unless, but Elimelech left Bethlehem and brought his family, brought his wife to Moab to search, for food and to try to survive. But God did not give him that direction to do that. I'm almost thinking that he told him to stay in place, and Elimelech chose not to. He chose his own way, just as some of us do sometimes. I know I have done it countless of times. I'm telling you, I would change back the hands of times, and there are so many decisions I would have made. There's so many times I would have put him first and put him in and include him in it. I would not, and not that I'm saying I have terrible life, but a lot of the problems that I faced and I have faced or currently facing probably would not have happened had I listened and had I go to God for myself. Unlikely collaborators. They were unlikely collaborators simply because Naomi, like I said, was an Israelite, and Ruth was a Moabite. The total geographical distance, as you saw on that map earlier, it don't look very big, but the River of Jordan is huge. It's more like a like a sea than exactly a river. You can see towards the other side. It's almost like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz. It looks small, but it's actually pretty large. You're definitely not swimming to the other side, at least, and expected to make it. So just keep that in mind, how far away they were from each other. You're talking about miles and miles. It was centuries of tension there between Moabs and the Israelites. They had often fight and have difficult relationships throughout the Old Testament. The Moabite also opposed Israel doing in the book of Exodus. If we go back and read that, there are some scriptures that I jotted down at the beginning that will lead us to that, and you can go back and read that as well. But you could tell that they were not friends. And hired Balaam to curse Israel and led Israel into idolatry and sexual immorality. That is found in Numbers 22 to 25. Too many Israelites, a Moabite would have been the last person they expected God to use because they didn't believe. They had their own God. And we said the unlikely collaborators rationale. I said earlier that we talked about Naomi worshiped God of Israel. Ruth grew up in worshiping the gods of Moab, including Chemosh. And I had jotted down that every thing that Ruth had and taught growing up was so different than what Naomi's had and how she was taught and how she was raised. Total different cultures, total different religion, and total different nationality. The language that they spoke was even different. They were different in generations as well because, of course, Naomi was older. I take it that Naomi was definitely elderly, as I said earlier. They were united only by tragedy throughout the readings. Of course, they were united by marriage, but they also experienced the same tragedy because they both lost their husbands. Ruth lost her father-in-law, Naomi lost her husband and their two sons. So they both shared, in that collaboration type, they shared grief, they shared loss. I can imagine them crying and sobbing on a regular basis because it's like they were so lost, they didn't know where to go, they didn't know what to do. Poverty, they didn't have no food, they had no money, no clothes, no shoot, I don't even know if they had probably shoes or whatever they wore back then, sandals, Jesus shoes, we call them. They had nothing. They were uncertain where they would end up. They didn't know where they're going to go. But when they chose to go back to Bethlehem, to back home, where Naomi's home, they didn't know what to expect. She really did expect them to receive her, because she did not have anything. Their relationship wasn't built on success. It was solely built on blood, tears, suffering, sorrow, loss, grief, sadness. But through that, many won't survive going through things like that. But these two, they made the best out of it. Next slide. To trust God's providence by remaining faithful to one another, as so God could accomplish his plan of redemption through their lives. This was the assignment of Naomi and Ruth, to trust his providence. Naomi never lost faith, although she was not as strong as she was before, her will to live and will of God. She was full of sorrow, but she just trusted and had faith that God was going to see her through. And she also was a hallmark for Ruth to see, and taught Ruth how to do the same. This also teaches us as Christians and followers of Christ. Sometimes God reveals his purposes while we're walking in obedience, not before. Ruth's assignment was to remain faithful. Ruth's assignment was to remain faithful, faithful to God and faithful to Naomi. They shared assignments. Together, Naomi and Ruth were called to do what? As we discussed earlier, demonstrate covenant of loyalty to one another, return to God's place of blessing, which was Bethlehem. They left the covenant. They left God's covering when they moved to Moab. I'm speaking of Elimelech and Naomi. They encouraged one another through grief. Sometimes it's okay to have a shoulder to cry on, but I couldn't imagine them being so lonely by themselves like that, sobbing consistently. Obviously, you're going to run out of things to say, but especially in that heat, man, it's just they made it through and they made it back to Bethlehem, as we'll see on the next few slides. We talked earlier, they trust God's providence and they prepared the way for redemption through Boaz. They preserved the family line through which King David was created, and ultimately Jesus Christ would come. And that's huge right there. Just like God makes no mistakes, man. If he can use a Moabite, man, boy, can he use us. Neither woman knew the last part. They didn't know that they were the pinnacle role in the coming of Christ. This is why Ruth and Naomi's collaboration was so profound, so important to us. And we can learn so much from their collaboration and the things that they experienced. But we first must learn obedience and the fall of Elimelech and his two sons because of his disobedience. Next slide. Naomi and Ruth, biblical contributions. These are some of the questions we had earlier on when I talked about this Bible study assignments. And it talks about the collaborations between them, and how it's contributed biologically throughout biblical practices. They had necessarily no biological contribution to one another. She lived in Naomi was as Israelite, and Ruth was a Moabite. But they had biological contribution through their sons, because Naomi's husband and her had the two sons. And they both, although they both died, they were married to one of them was married to Ruth and the other to Oprah. And giving birth to Mahlon and Chilion by Naomi, she, of course, was the mother-in-law of Ruth and Oprah. Through Mahlon's marriage to Ruth, God connected an Israelite family with a Moabite woman who had become a part of this redemption plan, his redemption plan. Naomi's family line became the bridge through which God brought Ruth into the covenant community. Ruth's biological contribution after marrying Boaz, Ruth gave birth to Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of the great King David. And from David, the royal lineage came Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Matthew 1, verse 5 and 6. Ain't that something? That almost give me chills just even thinking about it. Next slide. So Naomi and Ruth's collaboration fulfillment. We spoke earlier and we said they were unlikely. How would these two individuals meet? They're from so many different parts of the world. That's like, somebody meeting somebody from, Iran, who's extremely unlikely because we're at war and we're, in conflict right now, not at the hands of anything that we have done or, our disobedience, but it's somebody else's. I don't know very many Iranians, but I would imagine that Naomi didn't know a whole lot and know many Moabites prior to moving to Moab. But once she got there, of course, I'm sure she met some people, but they were still in a famine. And they were met with great sorrow and pain. The spiritual redemption contributions, when we talk about Ruth and Naomi, we will look in scriptures, Ruth 6 and 7, chapter 2, verse 20, chapter 3, 1 through 5, and chapter 4, verses 14 through 17, chapter 1, of course, we spoke about 16 and 17, Ruth chapter 2, 11, Matthew 1 and 5, we just got done talking about, and Ruth chapter 3, verses 10 through 11. Naomi's contributed greatly, introduced Ruth to God of Israel. Like we said earlier, Ruth did not know God of Israel. She chose to worship and praise and serve the God of Moab gods. And she modeled a covenant relationship with God, even though seasons of grief and sorrow, she succeeded. She chose to return to Bethlehem with Ruth along her side. She demonstrated repentance to God for leaving out of his will, off the course of the path that he chose for you. They chose their own path following her husband Elimelech, as most people would do, most wives would do. But she consistently repented and she wanted God's blessing again. She renewed her trust through God's providence. She shared her knowledge of God's law with Ruth. She shared Israel's customs. She shared the role of the kinsman redeemer. She guided Ruth throughout the major decisions that eventually led to her redemption. She continuously helped to model and covenant the family of her husband who have passed on, Elimelech. Ruth contributed, on the other hand. She left the idolatry worship to worship one true God. That was a major, major, major decision. So God makes no mistakes. He knows who he's choosing. Why would he choose a Moabite? It was in his plan. He had drawn it out. It was all orchestrated by him. This was no mistake. He blessed them, although they were disobedient, although they were left from under his covenant. He still loved them. He still cared for them. He never left them. He still was the God who he says he is at the end of the day. They modeled humility by faithfully serving Naomi. Ruth did. She also learned and began to trust God's humility, and by being faithful to Naomi. She trusted his providence without even knowing his complete plan, without even necessarily knowing him. She was faithful and loyal to Naomi, and she trusted her guidance. She trusted her mentorship. They both shared a redemptive contribution. They both did. Together, Naomi and Ruth became living example of what God's grace looks like. How coming back to him and just proclaiming his name and saying that he is the one true God and the one true King and the creator of heaven and earth. How merciful he was and how much grace he showed them and how prominent it was and how amazing it was for him to edify their life and change them and change the whole outlook of life just by them proclaiming his name and trusting and having faith in him. We can learn so much from him because although they made mistakes, we make them too. Our mistakes are just different. It's the same thing. He still loves us, man. And he still shows grace and he's still merciful, regardless of and in retrospect of who we think we are and some of the terrible things that we've done, said, or thought. They preserved the royal lineage of King David and prepared the earthly genealogy of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The biblical story of the faith, loyalty, and redemption between Ruth and Naomi is textbook of what loyalty and redemption is and how good God's grace is and how much he loves us and how merciful he can be if we call upon him. Next slide. And to continue with their faith contributions. They had faith, and Naomi did, and so did Ruth. They both returned. The faith, we call it the faith that returned. Naomi never lost faith in God. Although through much sorrow and pain and heartache and just famine, within herself, she never lost faith. So we wake up in those mornings and we're feeling down and out. I don't know about you, but I have those days sometimes. I have those dreadful, terrible days. But he's so faithful. And he's true to his word. So in those times, I feel like throwing in the towel. I'm reminded of Naomi and Ruth. I'm reminded of what they created. I'm reminded of how God used them. to create a man who would give his life for you and for me. The ultimate sacrifice for people he don't know. And we live today. We're free today because of that sacrifice. We owe a lot to Naomi and Ruth and what they contributed. If they never collaborated, where would we be? Although Elimelech was disobedient, God still used his disobedience and him turning his back on what God told him not to do. He still used his disobedience to create something so profound like no other. God can use us, man. I don't know what he's going to use me for to create, but I will live every day trying and searching for it. I too would love to be and have the redemption of Naomi and Ruth. So I'm going to remain faithful. I'm going to continue to trust him. I'm going to continue to allow him to lead and guide me in those days that I don't feel like church, on those days I don't feel like being here. I know who to call upon because I know he is there. Although Naomi and Ruth struggle with grief and disappointment, as we all do, she never completely abandoned her faith. Man, what if she had done that? She proclaimed and said and demonstrated through Naomi that she would return to Bethlehem after hearing that God had blessed his people again. They thought the land was not blessed anymore. So she didn't have to go, like Moses and be, God didn't speak to her like that. She didn't talk to a burning bush. There wasn't a messenger that came. It wasn't like Aaron. It wasn't somebody he sent, but they collaborated. They did not know why they were collaborating. They had no clue. But because of the love and loyalty of Ruth to Naomi, they created something phenomenal. They didn't turn their back. They kept the faith. They ran their course. They ran the race. And I know that God didn't frown on them upon the bad that they have done. He had it in his plan. And once they realize that we're going to walk and we're going to continue to encourage one another, when one falls, we pick them up. When one rests, we watch. When the other needs to take a break, okay, no problem. Take a break. I got you. We're right here. Fetching water from one another, I can possibly imagine. Ruth had the faith that followed. Ruth's faith wasn't as strong as Naomi's. Naomi's faith returned to Bethlehem. Ruth's faith followed Naomi to Bethlehem. Ruth's faith was demonstrated, through complete trust and unwavering obedience to Naomi. Her obedience turned into the obedience of God's will for their life. Ruth didn't know. She demonstrated her faith by leaving everything familiar to her, to the God of Moab, to serve the God of Israel, publicly declaring, "Your God shall be my God." Naomi, your God shall be my God. I'm not going to leave you. I'm loyal to your cause. We both hurt. Let's continue this journey together. It was something in her that she saw in Naomi. And I think it was the fruit that Naomi produced. The fruit that she carried amongst her. The ore that she had amongst her presence. Naomi knew, Ruth knew that Naomi was going to be blessed and is blessed. And she knew that God loved her. And she wanted the same thing for herself. Not being selfish, not trying to just choose because I want what you have. She chose her loyalty, and God used it. She trusts God enough to glean in the fields and believe he would provide. Following Naomi's counsel concerning Boaz, when Naomi sent Ruth into the field to glean in the field, to pick up the scraps and left over. And she met Boaz. She remained humble while waiting for God to do what he does best. And that just is what it is. Be great. Next slide. Naomi and Ruth collaboration, again, we talked that they were unlikely. Although it was fulfilled, the God's plan of redemption, God used Naomi and Ruth to preserve the family line. What appeared to be an ordinary family story became the part of the eternal plan and redeemed humanity. We found that in Ruth 4:13-22. I'm telling you, I want to teach this thing. In Matthew 1:5-6, God's covenant promise, the collaboration was so unlikely. But from the human perspective, Naomi and Ruth should have been gone their separate ways, right? They should have never, ever, ever, collaborated at all. But that was not God's plan. Although she was a Moabite and Naomi was Israelite. One older, one young. Didn't matter. The collaboration between the two of them was not accidental. It was a divine appointment. A complete divine appointment. So God's covenant has always been bigger than just one thing or one nation. It points to his desire for us, his desire to redeem all who come to him by just sheer faith. He's a redeemer. He is a provider. He's a sustainer. He's a forgiver. But we must have faith. The restoration of a broken family. Naomi believed her family was finished. She said this many times to Oprah and Naomi. I can't bear any more children. There's nothing I have to offer you. I can't offer you a son, Naomi. I can't offer you a son, Ruth. I can't offer you a son, Oprah. I have no husband. I have nothing. What do you want from me? Go your separate ways. Go find a husband for yourself. Go live your life. Ruth said no. God restored what she thought she had lost. God restored what they both lost. Through Ruth and Boaz, God preserved Elimelech's family line and gave Naomi a renewed hope. God will restore us more differently than we expect. But his restoration is no less real than what we see here. It correlates a beautiful picture of redemption and the power of covenant faithfulness. Their story introduced Israel to the role of the kingdom's redeemer. We said that earlier. Boaz redeemed Ruth and Naomi's family by forwarding to Jesus Christ, our ultimate redeemer, the great redeemer. Boaz redeemed the family. Jesus redeemed the world. Naomi and Ruth demonstrated genuine faith and expressed through their steadfast love and commitment and their loyalty for one another and their commitment to God. Their relationship reflected the covenant of love towards Israel, or towards God's people, towards their people. Their collaboration teaches us that faith is not merely believed. We got to live this thing. We got to be this thing. We got to seek his face. We got to die to ourselves daily, all the time. Next slide. Naomi and Ruth's collaboration is elements of necessity. Man, necessity of shared faith, necessity of covenant commitment, necessity of mutual dependence, the mission set out by God, necessity of humility, necessity of trust and obedience, and necessity of God's providence. So when we think of necessity of shared faith, although Naomi and Ruth came from different backgrounds, their collaboration became possible because their common faith in God of Israel. Naomi's faith influenced Ruth in such a magnificent way. Ruth embraced this faith as her own. She left Moab and left the Moab God who she had faith in and who she prayed to and who she worshiped to follow the God of Israel, to follow the great God. Now they shared the trust of God in God, which became the foundation of everything they would accomplish together. Every godly collaboration must begin with the shared commitment to God. Can two walk together unless they are agreed? That's found in Amos 3:3. Can two walk together unless they are agreed? Can you walk together believing different things? Yes, sure. Sure you can. But God's plan, if the both of you walking together, must be one, and you must worship, and you must have faith in the one true God, in the God of Israel. There's just no other. Their covenant commitment is Ruth had every opportunity to leave. She did. She chose to stay. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God is my God. Her commitment wasn't based on convenience, and she didn't want to be left alone. And, Naomi had something that she wanted, or she had money. She didn't have nothing. They didn't have nothing. So it was no reason for her to stay. But she believed, and she saw something in Naomi, and she wanted a piece of it. But that was God. Kingdom collaboration requires commitment that remains faithful, even when circumstances become difficult. Even when we have those sleepless nights and those dreadful thoughts, those terrible things, we have to have that kingdom faith. It is the pinnacle of what God has for us, and it requires our commitment. The necessity of the mutual dependence, neither Ruth nor Naomi could fulfill God's purpose alone. It had to be together. It had to be. If Naomi chose to go alone back to Bethlehem, there wouldn't have been Boaz. There wouldn't have been King David. There wouldn't have been Jesse. There wouldn't have been, oh Lord, Jesus Christ. So this thing is huge, man. This is not small. This is huge. This is a big, 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 big role. The necessity of humility. Each of them showed humility. Neither of them allowed pride to stand in their way. Naomi accepted help from Ruth. Ruth accepted help from Naomi. Ruth was willing to learn from Naomi. Neither tried to control one another. They worked together as a perfect team. They both served one another. Humility made their collaboration possible. Pride divides. When you're prideful, it just divides. It separates you from God, for one. It could separate you from your family. It separates you from your friends. It separates you from the things that you love and care about. It's definitely not pleasing to God. Humility unites. So when I shared my story in the beginning, and I told you I'm transparent, I have to be, because there's healing in that. Not only just for myself, but I'm not the only one. I know there's somebody that has hard days and bad days just like I do. If God don't do anything else for me, I can promise you, He have already done enough. So I'm going to continue to search and seek His faith and have that faith, and I'm gonna have humility. I'm gonna trust, and I'm gonna be obedient. I'm gonna have that covenant commitment. We should have that necessity, that shared faith. We should always want to have that mutual dependence. We should always want to be on a mission set out by Him, and we should always stay on the path and the course that He have chosen for us. We sometimes may veer off, but He always there to get us back on track. Don't be ashamed. Next slide. I think there's one prior to that. Nope, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. The personality and roles differences between Naomi and Ruth. We talked about that already. We discussed it. We said how they experienced the mentoree, Naomi the Israelite, Ruth the Moabite. You see the list there. Although Naomi and both they shared the same journey, they both brought very different personalities and roles through their collaboration. Their leadership and authority delegation, none was trying to control one another. They worked together as a team. Naomi's leadership provided spiritual guidance. It made strategic decisions to develop the plan for Ruth and to approach Boaz and begin this line of just phenomenal and great men who established great family line and brought our Jesus Christ, who here now with us. Ruth leadership. Ruth led differently though. She led through an example, humility, faithfulness, hard work, obedience, and she faithfully carried out Naomi's instruction, her plan that Naomi drew for them to head back to Bethlehem. I'm sure it was a long, very dreadful walk, because they certainly didn't have wagons, they didn't have no cars for sure. They were on feet, pat and turn, man, in that desert. I'm sure it was 1,000 degrees. I can tell you, man, it's hot out there, extremely, like no other. But they kept the faith and they kept moving. The delegation between the two of them, Naomi delegated the responsibility. Ruth executed the assignment. Naomi planned. Ruth performed. Both roles were equally important. They cannot work alone. They have the one fed off the other. Next slide. They faced a lot of external pressures, though. The collaboration faced enormous outside pressure from the people of Moab, and even when they returned to Bethlehem, to Israel. Ruth was a foreigner, which was a social pressure. Naomi returned home empty, broken, didn't have any money, nothing. Widows occupy one of the most vulnerable positions in society, even down to this day. People, if you lose a husband or lose a wife, people take advantage of you. They feed off of your hurt and your pain. They didn't allow that to happen, and that did not happen. Financial pressures. They had no income. They had no money. They had nothing. They had no land to cultivate. They depended upon gleaning, picking up the leftovers, crops. The things that people didn't want are the ones that fell. Cultural pressure. Moabs were viewed as with suspicion. Like, what y'all up to? What's going on? Ruth risked rejection because of her nationality. It was huge for Moab to come to Bethlehem, to Israel. She didn't know how they would take her, and neither did Naomi. They had faith that God would make a way. And he did. The emotional pressure that they face, of course, grief. They lost everyone. They lost their husband. They lost their her brother-in-law. And Naomi lost her other son, both sons. Loneliness, fear of the future. They didn't know what lies ahead. They didn't know what lied in Bethlehem when they returned. And uncertainty. Spiritual pressure. Both women knew God. Both women had to trust God without seeing his full plan. Their ego. One was the most beautiful aspect of Naomi and Ruth relationship is what was absent. No competition, no ego, no jealousy, no controlling tactics, no manipulation, no desire for recognition, no struggle for control, and no pride. Naomi's willing to receive help was key. Ruth willing to serve was the collaboration and the partnership between the two of them. Each of them loved and adored and honored one another. Where humility exists, collaboration flourishes. Where pride exists, collaboration struggles. External pressures reveal strength of their faith instead of destroying it. It just grew stronger and stronger. Next slide. Naomi's relationship and Ruth's relationship to God and how that planned out. Naomi's relationship with God, and Naomi was an Israelite, as we know. She understood God's covenant with Israel. She understood God's laws. Despite her suffering, Naomi never abandoned God. Although the struggle to understand God's purpose, she continued to acknowledge his sovereignty. She recognized that God was still in control. She couldn't understand his plan. Naomi's faith journey, on the other hand, knew God before the trial. She questions God's purpose during the trial, returned to Bethlehem in faith, experienced God's restoration after the trial. The Almighty has dealt very bitter with me, Ruth said in verse 20 of chapter 1. Although Naomi misunderstood what God was doing, she just didn't have any direction necessarily. She never stopped believing that he was sovereign and that his plan was in action, and she trusted his plan, although she didn't know. Although sometimes it was difficult. Sometimes mature faith still exists, and it still asks difficult questions. God is not offended by our honest struggles. He's not offended. I used to think he was, but why would he be? He invites us to trust him, even when we don't understand him. It was at this moment that Ruth left behind her homeland, her family, her culture, her religion, that she embraced. She embraced the God of Israel, God's covenant people, the new life of her faith. Ruth's faith journey, she left idolatry. She chose the God of Israel. She walked by faith and not by sight. She trusted God's providence. She became the messianic lineage. Ruth reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace and mercy. Faith is not nationality. It brings us into God's redemption's family. God brought together something phenomenal, a woman with a season of faith, a woman with a growing faith. Naomi contributed experience with Ruth, and Ruth contributed flesh devotion. One reminded the other that God is faithful. Together, their faith became stronger. Teamwork and unity, they worked without competition, supporting each other in their ministries. They continued God's work despite personal failures and opposition, and forgiveness and reconciliation They move forward after mistakes and modeling God's restoration for themselves. Next slide. We're almost there. The pre-collaboration call, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi, the covenant woman, and prepared through experience. God had already shaped her life through his covenant. She would not have known. Before the collaboration, Naomi's role included the following: living as a part of God's covenant people, building a home with her husband Elimelech, raising her two sons Mahlon and Chilion, passing the knowledge of God's Israel to her family, enduring seasons of hardship. Although Naomi didn't know, God was preparing her to become a mentor, spiritual guide, and example for perseverance. Sometimes God prepares us for a future ministry through present difficulties. Naomi's plan became a part of God's preparation. Ruth, on the other hand, Ruth's individual calling, a prepared woman through faith. It was before Ruth met Naomi. She was simply a young Moabite woman who praised Moabite God and worshiped Moabite God. She knew nothing about Bethlehem, Boaz, Israel covenant, the coming Messiah. Nobody knew that. Yet God was already working in her life. Ruth's preparation included development a heart of loyalty, learning humility, demonstrating faithfulness within her family, becoming willing to leave everything familiar to her to follow Naomi to Bethlehem. Next slide. The value between the two of them. The value partnership between Naomi and Ruth, the partnership is all of the most instructive example in the Bible of how complementary roles, trust, and shared purpose can achieve great things. Healthy biblical collaboration strengthens the relationship with God. The evidence of collaboration success here. We see these 3 and 7 examples that I came back with. I said that the spiritual value of their collaboration strengthens one's faith, their relationship value, their leadership value, kingdom value, ministry value, generational value, and redemption value. The evidence of the collaboration success is Naomi's hope was restored, God's provision never failed, Boaz redeemed the family, their family line continued, their faithfulness and fulfilled God's purpose, and their legacy endures. A healthy biblical collaboration strengthens our relationship with God. Let's talk about the leadership value. Naomi's led through wisdom, experience, spiritual guide, and Ruth led through faith, humility, servanthood, action. They are different leadership styles, but they're complementing one another. God don't need people to be the same. He don't need identical leaders. He uses complementary leaders all the time who complements each other. Next slide. When we look and talk about the revelation of the collaboration, this is the greatest evidence and success was not just their circumstances that changed. It was what was ultimately created. Naomi and Ruth never set out to become famous. They simply chose to be faithful. The success of Naomi and Ruth's collaboration was not proven by what they gained, but only by what God accomplished through their faithful obedience. Next slide. And the final thoughts that I have throughout this biblical teaching between the biblical collaborators of Naomi and Ruth, I want us to remember something very important here. The story is about far more than just two widows overcoming difficulty circumstances. It's about how sovereign God is. It's about God's accomplishing his eternal purpose through two ordinary, unlikable, and unlikely people who chose to remain faithful. Naomi never imagined that her greatest ministry would be placed in her lineage of Jesus Christ. Who would have thought? Boaz never imagined that his act of obedience would become the greatest picture of redemption in all scriptures. To allow Ruth to glean in his field, and he would ask them to drop his servants and his workers to leave some for her to glean. God knew, as he knows everything, from the beginning to the end. He knew every tear Naomi would cry, as he knows yours and he knows mine. He knows every step Ruth would take. He knows every step you and I would take. He knew every conversation. He's listening to the things that we say. Don't find it weird to talk to him. He knows, but sometimes I can tell you he likes to hear it. He certainly knows our heart. Every hardship he knows. Every blessing he knows. He knows every chapter. Nothing in God's plan happened by accident. Everything happens according to God's promises and to his providence, if we're walking in faith. What this collaboration taught us, what Naomi teaches us, is that God can restore hope after sorrow, after heartbreak, after mistakes, after shortcomings, after failure. He can restore. He will restore. He promises us to. But we got to have faith. We got to trust him. And we got to take that step. Ruth teaches us faith often requires leaving the familiar places, leaving what's comfortable to embrace God's future. Boaz teaches us redemption always comes at a cost. Together, they all taught us throughout this lesson that God's greatest work is often accomplished through ordinary, unlikely people who simply remain faithful. Our last lesson. Naomi and Ruth never saw a complete picture. They didn't know about David. They didn't know about Bethlehem becoming the birthplace of Messiah. They certainly didn't know about Jesus. They simply didn't trust. They simply trusted God without the next step that challenges us all. Because sometimes we're asking God to show us an entire plan when God is simply asking us to just trust him today. Maybe you and I both today feel like Naomi. We have experienced loss, shortfalls, disappointments, heartache, heartbreak, and we wonder if God is finished with us. This story reminds us that the answer is a resilient, resounding no. He's not. He isn't through with us. Maybe today you're like Ruth. God is asking you to step into the unfamiliar territory, to just trust him, have faith in him,